Okay, so last week we talked again about the two jobs of the apologist. What are the two jobs of the apologist? To properly
explain the gospel.
Explain the Christian position.
Correct. Christian worldview.
Yes, the Christian worldview.
And refute the non-Christian.
And refute the non-Christian worldview. And according to Proverbs chapter 26.
Do not answer a fool according to his folly, and do not answer.
And answer a fool, or do not. I didn't know if
it's one of
sorry.
Answer and don't.
Answer and don't. And then what do we mean by that when we say answer a fool according to his folly and don't answer a fool according to his folly? What does the Bible mean by that, and how do we apply that apologetically?
Well, don't assume. No, go ahead. I'm just talking too much now.
Well, I was gonna say, one was don't assume that they are that they know, because they may not understand what it is. They're going based on what they hear from everybody else, and like they're assuming things in their head.
Yeah, that's for sure. And that would be part of what we talked about. The first thing is properly explaining the Christian worldview over against misrepresentations.
Right. Don't get sucked into his standing on his worldview.
Right.
So don't answer a fool according to his folly.
But then, and right, so we don't want to stand on his worldview because we don't want to give him any ground in which he thinks there's neutral ground in which you guys are both going to reason to. And what did we say about neutrality?
There is
none. There is none. They're what?
Biased as much as we are.
Right, okay, they're not neutral, and you
aren't neutral.
And you shouldn't be neutral. They're not neutral, and you shouldn't be neutral. And then when we step onto the Christian, into their worldview, we do an internal critique. And what are the two major things we're looking for when we do an internal critique of the system of the unbeliever? Inconsistency and arbitrariness. Those are the two major sins that they commit, that we are not going to let them get away with. They're going to be inconsistent. They're going to be arbitrary. They're going to hold things on their worldview that are incompatible with each other, and it's an antithesis. And that's what you're going to do. You're going to press that antithesis. You're going to hold their feet to the fire. And in fact, they assume things that only Christianity can explain, particularly with atheism, such as morality, the ideas of right and wrong that can't be explained on a non-Christian worldview. Okay, so we're going to go to the next worldview that we're going to look at, which is closely associated with atheism, and that is the worldview of evolution. And again, we're going to do the two things. We're going to step off and look at Christianity and how Christianity can explain the actual scientific world in which we see it, and then we're going to talk about, God willing, we're going to talk about what the problems on an evolutionary worldview. This has fallen to a bit on hard times right now. Okay, so actually, let's look at a verse here, just so we're not using the Bible. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 11. If you want to look it up, you're more than welcome to look it up. I'll just read it for you. It says, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." And that's Exodus 20, verse 11. Moses recounting the 6 days of creation. Quite honestly, young earth science is falling on hard times right now, really hard times, even in Christian communities and even in Reformed Christian communities. And it's given way, I think partly it's given way because people misuse the Bible scientifically, number one. And just so you know, when I say that, I'm coming from a position where I believe in a young earth creation. I believe in a literal 6-day creation, young earth creation. But I've heard Christians so try to make science fit into the Bible that it becomes ridiculous, to where they're not allowing the Bible to kind of speak as a book that it was written to. The Bible is not a scientific book. It's a historical redemptive book. Now, as part of the history of the Bible, it tells us that God created the world about 6,000 to 10,000 years ago in 6 days. That's what the Bible says as a history book. Is there science to verify that? Yes, there is science to verify that. And evolution doesn't. Evolution's a horrible theory fraught with all kinds of problems. But unfortunately, we have people trying to, in many ways, squeeze way too much out of some statements in the Bible, that they think that that are scientific that aren't, and then not allowing the Bible to speak to kind of the field that it speaks to. So, for example, I'll just give you an example of this. People try to squeeze like molecular biology out of it, or atom biology out of statements such as God made all. I forgot the verse now. It was right on the tip of my tongue, and I thought about it before I came in. The world that's made is held together by the invisible world.
Oh,
You know,
that,
I'm sorry, this is going to sound bad on here. I'm supposed to be
no. It's,
supposed to hold a doctorate, and I can't remember the verse here. But
Isn't it in Colossians?
I think it's in Hebrews, as I recall. But anyway,
The things that are not seen.
yeah, the things that are not seen.
Yeah.
And people say, well, no, that's not what he's talking about there. We're not. And anytime you make a new scientific discovery, people try to fit the Bible into that scientific discovery. And it really just, in many places, destroys the Bible, I think. It doesn't allow the Bible to speak for what it is. So, for example, and this evolutionists have said this back to us. So, for example, Jesus said the smallest seed is the mustard seed. But is that the smallest seed in the world?
No.
Well, no, it's not the smallest. So is Jesus wrong? Well, no, it's the smallest seed of the category of seeds that they were talking about, that they would have known. It would have done no good for Jesus to mention to these people some seed that they don't know, that they have no idea that it ever existed. Okay, so he's speaking to an audience and he's saying, in your world, this is the smallest seed. He's not speaking scientifically. It would be a little bit like today, for example, blackberries. You can even think a little bit differently about this. Have any of you called a tomato a vegetable?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's just a common thing that you say. It's not, nobody's going to come along, and nobody should come along. Oh, you're wrong, you're unscientific, you called it a vegetable. Even some things that we call fruit aren't technically what's considered fruit. So, for example, blackberries are not fruits. They're drupes. They have their own category. But we call it a fruit.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah, we call it a fruit. Now, nobody's going to come along, nobody should come along and say, oh, you're so unscientific that you call it fruit.
What an ignorance.
Yeah, but the Bible was written to a particular period of time, to a particular people, to a particular understanding. Now, everything it says about science, if it makes a scientific statement, it's true. But that's different than saying the Bible was trying to address science. It was not trying to address science. People say, well, it's finally, people just change. So let's just for a minute, how could I explain this? Let's for a minute pretend like we went into outer space and we found out the world was flat. Let's just pretend that for a minute, okay? What would you, all the science creationists go on, see? The Bible, the whole time, said the world was flat. It said the four corners of the earth. They'd run through the Bible looking for all these scientific things saying, see, the Bible was right. It said the four corners of the earth. It says he sits above the circle of the earth. We make all these kind of things. Well, we do the same thing with what we call science today. We try to go through the Bible and find places where it justifies it. But the problem is what we call science is a moving target. What was science yesterday is not science today. What was science, now truth doesn't change, but our understanding of truth changes. Mm-hmm. And Christians get in the position of saying some really, really stupid things. And they said some really stupid things about evolution because they thought, so for example, with the ark, there was a time where Christians said, well, Noah's ark must have been big enough to fit every kind of dog, every breed of animal, because it said every kind of animal was on the ark. Not now today. What do we understand? Well, he was talking about kinds of animals. He didn't have to bring every kind of dog. He just had to bring 2 dogs. But Christians at one time tried to defend the Bible scientifically and say, well, then he must have brought a dingo and a Clydesdale and a regular horse, a colt, and there were actual books during that period that tried to defend that.
Every
Don't do
variation
that.
within the species.
Don't do that. There are scientific problems with evolution, and what you want to do is you want to destroy evolution. and you want to agree with what the Bible says scientifically on its historical grounds. There's no other way to read the New Testament or the Old Testament and not see that he is talking about 6,000 years ago and a 6-day creation. That's it. None of us were there to see it, but somebody was there who wrote it down. God told us what it was. Evolution is also a belief about the past. Very quickly, I want to talk about 2 ways that Christians have given into. That's one way, because they go the other way, super into creation science. And then another way is by abandoning young Earth 6-day creation.
And that's going on today.
Oh yeah, like crazy.
Even
John Piper,
Really?
D.A. Carson, all kinds of people are saying, well, it's not important. We don't need to bother with it. You name it. You name the person out there who you kind of respect, and a lot of them are even like in a lot of Calvary Chapel pastors who you'd think would be young Earth creationists or not young Earth creationists. Walter Martin wasn't. Walter Martin said that, I've listened to it many times, that the Earth is billions of years old and that scientists know better than we do. So there are 2 theories that are really popular right now, and one's called the gap theory, and the other one's called the framework hypothesis. So I want you to be aware of both of those. There's what's called the gap theory and the framework hypothesis. So the gap theory says that there is a gap between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. So if you have your Bible, you can look at Genesis 1:1. Now, honestly, these are all attempts that were developed after evolution. So nobody believed these things, particularly no Jew believed these things before.
Well, I've decided that.
Yes, right. But I want you to be aware of these 2 things that are out there right now. And as I have been studying, because I'm always open to things and listening to people like Hugh Ross, who believes in old Earth. Again, I'm just like, no, you're wrong. And there's good scientific evidence to prove that you're wrong. And there's good scientific evidence against evolution as well. We'll get to those things as well. Not just scientific evidence, but philosophical evidence as well. So Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And look at verse 2. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Are you familiar with the gap theory? I haven't heard.
A little bit.
Okay, so basically,
There's something in between, yeah.
Basically what they say is there is a gap between verses 1 and verse 2. And the reason why they say that is the term was can mean became. Like when it's the same word that talked about where Lot's wife became a pillar of salt. So, it looked back, and you can use that term. He looked back and she was a pillar of salt. Well, you can equally translate that it became a pillar of salt. So the earth, and they'll translate this, the earth became without form and void, and darkness was covering the face of the deep. And what they believe about this, now these people who believe this, you must understand, they believe old earth, young Adam. So they still believe the biblical timeline as far as Adam was concerned on. They believe that, but they believe that this is where the dinosaurs fit in, and that there was this world that Satan ran here, where he was the king of creation. He kind of played the same role Adam played, and that he rebelled against God, and then God made the world become without form and void. And there are other verses that they use to try to justify this. One of the biggest ones is this idea of that he was over the face of the deep. The deep, there's the abyss. And all the imagery of Satan, is something that comes out of the abyss. So his home's the abyss, everything kind of the demonic. Yeah, but it's also a parallel thing for
Comes out of the ocean.
For Satan.
Evil comes out.
Evil comes out of the ocean. The problem that I have with this is there was no Hebrew scholar before the advent of evolution that believed this, that translated it that way. And while it's true that the word was can also be translated became, so I'm not an expert in Hebrew. I'm not an expert in Hebrew at all. I do know a few words and whatever, the letters and a few basic vocabulary. But Hebrew is a very limited vocabulary language. And when you have a limited vocabulary language, words often do double duty. A lot of words do double duty. You have like a lot of synonyms, and I'm trying to think of the proper term there, but you have a lot of words that play double duty. So sign language is one of those languages that's very basic, and you can mean like, this sign right here means strong, but it can also mean recover. It can also mean healthy. It really is highly, highly context dependent because it's a limited vocabulary situation. And Hebrew is a more limited vocabulary language. And when you have a limited vocabulary, words just play double duty. That's all there is to it. So just because you can doesn't mean you should. Yeah.
Okay, so the people who, and let me get this straight, who believe in the gap theory, they say that a world existed prior.
Yes.
Then the became void was after God overthrew that world and like started over again in a sense?
Yes.
Okay.
And then he started over. Now these
Yeah.
people here, they still believe in young Adam.
From the time Adam came.
Yeah, this has been 6,000 to 10,000 years.
Okay. So where in the world would they, well, it's pure speculation when it comes to Satan ruling over it and him being like an Adam.
They get those, so there's little things out of like Ezekiel where it says that he was in the garden of God and he had the topaz and he was wearing and they were thinking, well, was he alongside Adam there, or maybe he was in a world before Adam, and then Adam replaces him. In the new world, Adam replaces him in their theory of that. So I bring that up.
Speculative.
It's very speculative. And my biggest problem with it is that it was a theory that was invented after evolution to try to make evolution fit the Bible.
Right.
And that's muddle-headed thinking. That's not exegesis. That's trying to read something into the text because you're threatened by what people consider to be science, which isn't science, by the way.
Trying to fit evolution or carbon dating with the age?
Trying to fit an old Earth into a young Earth model, Earth model kind of a thing.
Okay.
Trying to explain why we have old Earth scientific data and young Earth scientific data. Trying to put the two together. Okay. So that's on the rise again. That's coming up again, particularly with a guy I really like him a lot when it comes to a lot of stuff he says, but a lot of stuff he says I don't like, and that's Michael Heiser. He does some really good work, but when it comes to this, it's not my favorite. The other one is the framework hypothesis. This one's a little bit more popular among Reformed people. And the framework hypothesis basically says that the first few verses of Genesis are poetic because you have day and night, and then on day 1 and on day 4 you have sun, moon, and stars, and on day 2 you have sea and air, and on day 5 you have fish and birds, and then on day 3 you have the land, and then you have day 6 land animals. So they try to say that this is a poetic form and that it shouldn't be taken literally because it's a poetic type of form. And they actually believe, so someone like Hugh Ross believes that evolution happened, and what God did was he took one of the hominids, the ape men type people, and then readjusted their DNA and breathed into that person the spirit of life. So he still believes in a young Adam. He still believes in 6,000 years, but he believes that evolution happened all this time, and that what God did was he didn't create Adam out of the dust of the earth or anything like that. That's just like all. It says. Yeah, like it says. But basically what he did was he he just asked, he just took one of these ape creatures, and then made them, and that there's a whole civilization of ape men that's who Cain married. Cain married some type of ape woman, and then
Wait a minute, this is ringing a bell of,
Planet of the Apes.
well, not just them, but also Proverbs. It says, do not argue with the fool according to his folly, lest
Right.
you be like him. That's what they're doing.
yes, they are. They are.
I see more, and you said the word, and I was looking something up too on that. It's basically you're taking the words of the Bible figuratively or literally. There's a problem where they're mixing the two in the wrong times. You know, they're
Yes,
putting one thing in one position, they're just not. I don't know.
they are.
That's what I'm
They're
saying.
not
That's
taking
basically the problem. Is they're taking the
Genesis-
wrong thing figuratively and the wrong thing literally. Going, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Genesis is a historical narrative.
Yes, it's a historical narrative.
It's not poetic. It's not poetic.
And even times where you can have a piece of poetry doesn't mean that the overall book isn't historical narrative. The biggest problem I have is these are all developed afterwards. Nobody thought of this stuff before. Actually, I shouldn't say that. There were some people before the day-age theory was way before. So Thomas Aquinas, unfortunately, believes something similar to that. Nobody today believes the day-age theory, by the way. The day-age theory is that was that one day was one age, a day equals 1,000 years, and so each day is an age. That I don't know anybody today that believes the day-age theory, although it was a popular view at one time. The problem is there's really no reason to believe in evolution. That's the biggest problem. You need to get past the fact, the idea that evolution is science and what we have is faith. No, there is a group of scientific evidence out there, and one person interprets that according to a biblical narrative, and one person interprets that according to a non-biblical narrative. And what you must get through your head, and what you must actually have the other person get through their head when you're talking to an evolutionist, somebody who believes in evolution, is that what they're believing is a philosophical model about the past, about origins. They are not believing science. They are believing a philosophical belief about origins. Whenever I talk to an evolutionist, I ask them this question first. They say, oh, well, I believe in evolution. I always say, what kind of evolution? Which particular theory? And that normally stumps most of them. They're like, well, I don't know. I was like, well, you never thought about it?
I didn't know there was more than one.
Oh, there are many theories of evolution that compete. And they're actually, in scientific journals, they're pretty vicious towards each other. Mm-hmm. So there's Darwinianism, Neo-Darwinianism, and punctuated equilibrium are probably the three most popular. Now, Darwinianism was the first one. That was kind of the original one that said that we kind of came from an amoeba, and then we grew up and we became an ape, and then the ape finally became a man. And it happened gradually, okay? So that's Darwinianism. But however, Darwinianism had problems, and nobody believes strict Darwinian evolution anymore. No scientist today believes strict Darwinian evolution today. And don't make the mistake that they do. One way in which Christians make the mistake that I've heard is by saying, well, how can we still have monkeys if we still have man? If we have men, why are there still monkeys? That's a stupid thing to say. Don't say that. You're just going to embarrass yourself, unless you're dealing with somebody who doesn't know. But the problem is they don't believe that. They believe man and ape had a common ancestor. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're just, if you say, well, why, I even heard, unfortunately, and I like the guy, but it was Stephen Baldwin, when he was on The Apprentice, say this to somebody. He said, well, how come, he's a Christian. Yeah. He said, well, how come they're still, what I don't understand about evolution, and praise God for him, he's doing the best he can, but, how come there are still monkeys? Now, every scientific evolutionist, you might get away with that with somebody on the street, but you post that somewhere, and every scientific evolutionist is going to laugh at you because you're not up on the latest theories of evolution. They believe in what's called Neo-Darwinian evolution, which doesn't believe that we all have a common ancestor, but we were not at one time monkeys. Okay, that's a myth. But I always ask, what kind of evolution do you believe in? And they, well, I don't know. I mean, I just believe science, man. It's like, well, yeah, but what kind? You told me you believe evolution. What kind of evolution do you believe in? The other one that's popular, it's not as popular as Neo-Darwinian evolution, but it's called punctuated equilibrium. Okay, punctuated equilibrium, and it's also called the hopeful monster fallacy. Now, punctuated equilibrium came about by a man by the name of Stephen Jay Gould.
Yes.
And the reason it came about is because there are gaps in the fossil record. There are no transitionary life forms in the fossil record. Okay, so in the fossil record, you do find like amoebas kind of in one layer, you kind of find trilobites in one layer, and you kind of find horses in another layer, and you find, all kinds of things in another, but you don't find any transition. They're fully functioning. There's no like half horse or something that's died out that was the predecessor of a horse. And so punctuated equilibrium came along and said, well, what must have happened is evolution must have happened quickly because of a catastrophe. So a catastrophe happened, and then all these people, due to survival of the fittest, or all these things due to survival of the fittest, became horses right away. And so the proof, it's just a burst of change, So the proof that this happened is that there's no proof that it happened. So there's no proof in the fossil record, and I say, well, see, that's proof. The proof that it happened is that there's no proof, because if it would have happened that way, then of course we would expect to not find any proof. Okay, well does that sound to me like somebody who's grinding a presupposition before he gets to the evidence? The evidence, there are no transitional forms in the fossil record. There's just horses, there's just dogs, there's just dinosaurs. There's no like proto-dinosaur kind of a thing. So that's the first question I ask. I always ask, what kind of evolution do you believe? And as soon as they say whatever kind, I always ask them the second question. Now, why am I doing this? Because I'm putting the onus on them. I'm putting the onus back on them. Remember, I'm going to hammer them. I'm going to make them justify their theory. What kind of evolution do you believe? And then I always ask this question, what do you think is the greatest proof of evolution? What's the greatest proof that you have? Now, can you think of anybody who's ever answered that question?
The greatest proof?
Yeah, if I said, well, what's your best evidence? I said, you believe in evolution, you tell me it's scientific. What do you think is the best evidence for evolution?
Well,
They may say Lucy.
Yeah, we'll talk about Lucy in a minute. I always kind of inquire because most people don't know about Lucy, but they'll say, oh, well, they'll say something like that and say, well, that's your best evidence. Now, I've never heard them say, now I'm going to give you the best answer that I've heard from the top evolutionary apologists. And they'll say something like, genetic information is similar between apes and people. And you've probably heard that before too. I mean, an ape is like we share 95% of the similarities. Okay, I've never heard them not commit a logical fallacy. That is a logical fallacy, and evolution is fraught with logical fallacy. So we're gonna have to dig back into our logic course, but they are fraught with logical fallacy. That is a logical fallacy. It's the violation of modus ponens. Does everybody remember?
Modus ponens.
No, I don't think you were here for that. Okay, now I'll show you this fallacy. And as soon as they say that, because that's the one that I hear most common, I'll say, well, do you realize that that's a violation of a law of logic? Do you have any evidences that aren't violations of laws of logic? No, well, what do you mean it's a violation of the laws of logic? Okay, so modus ponens says, if P, then Q. Oh, you remember?
That's right.
If P, well, you can get A, B. Okay, A, B. So this little line right here, this little circle, that means if. Okay, so if P, then Q. This is the right version of modus ponens. P, what does those three little dots mean? Therefore. Therefore Q. Okay, now that is a correct argument of modus ponens. Now P and Q and P represent anything you want to put there. A good example of this is
All dogs.
if it rains outside, then the grass will be wet. The grass is wet, therefore it rained outside. It's called modus ponens. That's a valid form of argumentation. This is called, does anybody remember what this part's called?
Predicate?
No, the antecedent.
Oh, the antecedent.
The antecedent. I'm not going to spell it. And this is called, remember? The consequent. The consequent. The antecedent and the consequent. So if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. This is modus ponens. It's called the affirmation of the antecedent, which is perfectly fine to do. Okay. What people do is they affirm the consequent, sorry. If P, then Q, Q, therefore P. Okay, that's wrong. That will always be wrong. They'll always be invalid. I should say that. Shouldn't necessarily be wrong, but it will always be invalid.
It has nothing to do with truth. It's logic.
Right. Well, it's always invalid. So if it rains outside, then the grass will be wet. The grass is wet, therefore it rained outside. What's the problem with that?
It may not have rained
Could
outside.
have watered the grass with a hose.
There are all kinds of
That's
reasons.
the first thing I thought when you wrote it. I go, how do you know it?
There are all kinds of reasons the grass could be wet, right? So this is a violation of the law of logic. You violated the laws of logic. So if we descended from a common ancestor, then we would have genetically similar material. We have genetically similar material, therefore we've descended from a common ancestor. No. Because there are other reasons why we might have genetically similar material. God may have used the same design. So that was pretty, the idea that there are the same kinds of parts you would find in a helicopter that you would find in a car doesn't mean that the helicopter evolved from the car. Just means that the person thought that was a good design. I'm going to use that over here as well. Okay, so they use this. I've never heard them not use this problem, and I always say, well, you've just used a logical fallacy to validate. Do you have something that's not a logical fallacy to validate your claims that evolution is true? And guess what they've got? None. And as a matter of fact, they commit logical fallacies all the time. So I'm going to go through a couple of logical fallacies that when you're talking to an evolutionist, they are more likely to commit. The first one and the biggest one is equivocation. Okay, this is more of an informal fallacy, but it can be used formally as well. Equivocation is the fallacy where, does anybody remember? Where a word can mean two different things. Okay, the overarching fallacy here is ambiguity. Okay, that's when something isn't quite clicking in their argument because it's not clear. And this is equivocation, means that a word can mean two different things. Okay, and then they switch the meaning of that word in the middle of their argumentation. Okay, it's fine to have words mean more than one thing. That's not a big deal. But in an argumentation, it is wrong to do. So here's a couple of examples that you'll be able to spot right away. So if I say, and then I'll show you how it applies, how evolutionists use it. If I say something like, practice makes perfect, doctors practice medicine, therefore doctors are perfect. What word changed meanings? Practice, right? The word practice isn't the same. By doctors practicing medicine, and practice makes perfect, I've just equivocated on the word practice there. Okay, if I say doctors know a lot about health, I have a doctorate, therefore you should listen to me when it comes to health. What word did I equivocate on? Doctorate, because doctor can mean what? MD or PhD, okay, or DD or MDiv or whatever, so I've equivocated on that word. So that happens a lot. People do this because words sometimes can mean different things in different contexts. Save soap and waste paper. Do I mean save soap and throw away paper, or do you mean save soap and also save waste paper? Waste is, you can equivocate on that word. Sometimes you can equivocate on whole sentences, okay? So if I say to you, we're not going to the zoo because it's Saturday. Are we going to the zoo or are we not going to the zoo? If I say we're not going to the zoo because it's Saturday,
We're not going.
oh, we're not.
Because we don't know if it's Saturday though.
No, oh yeah, well, yeah, that would be another thing. We could be going to the zoo, but not because it's Saturday. We're going to the zoo to learn. We're not. See, you thought we were going to go to the zoo because it's Saturday, but we're going to the zoo.
We're not going because it's Saturday.
Right.
Oh, okay. It's how you.
See, what word did I equivocate on? Because, right? Well, the whole sentence can be ambiguous. Okay, the whole sentence can mean we either are going to the zoo or we're not going to the zoo. The whole sentence could mean we're not going to the zoo, and the reason we're not going to the zoo is because it's Saturday.
And it's gonna be crowded.
Yeah, and then the other thing is we are going to the zoo, but we're not going to the zoo because it's Saturday. We're going to the zoo because it's a good place to go.
This is awesome.
Okay, you can also equivocate because of accent. Whole sentences can change because of accent. The whole meaning of a sentence can change because of an accent. I should not steal my neighbor's car. Okay, I should not steal my neighbor's car.
You sound like Yoda.
Now, if I say I should not steal my neighbor's car, but if I say I should not steal my neighbor's car,
Ooh, but I can do it for you.
yeah, or you can, or yes. What if I say I should not steal my neighbor's car?
But I'm going to anyways.
Yes. How about I should not steal my neighbor's car?
Borrow it. That's
I
okay.
can borrow it. Yes, I can borrow it. I should not steal my neighbor's car.
Steal his truck.
Right.
Take the car.
It's the same almost every language. It's the same in any language.
Yes, it is. But you see, you can go through every word and emphasize it. I should not steal my neighbor's car.
Because you'll get caught.
Well, I could steal somebody else's
Yeah.
car, right? Okay, all right. So do you see the fallacy of equivocation? Now, they equivocate on the word evolution in science all the time. Okay, they'll say something like, we believe in science, or we believe in evolution. Evolution is demonstrated in plants. I mean, obviously, you can see that they've made pea plants resistant to frost, and now they're able to grow pea plants up north and provide food. That's evolution right there. How can you say you don't believe in evolution? Okay, well, okay, so they're equivocating on the term evolution.
Micro and
They're-
macro.
Yes, by microevolution, they mean change within a species, which I believe in. I believe in changes within a species. But that doesn't then therefore mean that everything that you put under the umbrella of evolution is true. See, they've equivocated on that word evolution. They'll say things like, well, you believe in science. Evolution is science. Therefore, evolution's true. Now, they've just equivocated there. Do you believe in science? Yeah, I do believe in science.
Just not your science.
Yeah, is evolution science?
Oh.
Well, be careful. Evolution, even if it was, that's still equivocation. Because what you're talking about is the scientific method. I believe in science as a method that you look at something, you observe it, you make a hypothesis, you test the hypothesis, you make a theory, and then you make a fact. Okay, that's how we do scientific induction. But then to say, oh, well, evolution is science, you've just equivocated on the term, on the term science. Because when they say evolution is a science, what they're talking about is a scientific model of origins. So they've just changed the scientific method to a science of origins, a model. Also don't say that evolution is just a theory or even just a hypothesis. That is true. It's not a theory. I mean, it's not a science. It is a hypothesis. But you understand that scientists, like their whole life, they try to come up with a theory that fits the facts. So to say it's just a theory is kind of an overstatement. You know, say, oh, well, that's just a theory. Yeah, it is just a theory, but theories are important. Theories are really important. in the scientific community. You're trying to, quasars and string theory and stuff. These are theories. That doesn't mean they're unscientific just because they're a theory, okay? They have to be. So I get kind of hesitant when people say, well, evolution is just a theory. Yeah, it is a theory. But so is creation. Creation is a theory on models. Now, I think it's a correct theory, but it's a theory on the origin of the universe. They're origin theories. Okay. The next one that they do is reification. Reification is when you assign concrete ideas to abstract things. The evidence speaks for itself. Well, evidence doesn't speak.
Assign what again? Say it again.
It's when you assign something concrete to something abstract. Okay. They do that with science and evolution as well. My job called me. Your job didn't call you. Now, reification is fine in literature, okay? I mean, the Bible uses reification, but as part of an argument, it's invalid, okay? Science tells us that evolution is true. No, science doesn't tell you. Science tells you something? No, science is a concept. Scientists might tell you that they believe in evolution. Say, well, science is atheistic. Oh, science has beliefs about God? I didn't know science had beliefs about God. No, it's an abstract idea. Now, I get it when people are saying that, but in a debate, I always call people out on that. Well, wait a minute, you're committing a fallacy. Because I want to show them that they're not as, I want to take them down a peg or two. I mean, I want to show them that they're not as, oh, we have science and you have faith. We have this and you have that. And I want to show them, no, I'm just as intelligent as you are. As a matter of fact, you're showing your ignorance. So I always get them on these ones. I try to anyway. I shouldn't say I always get them on this one. Okay, either or fallacy. That's another one that they do. You'll see that fallacy a lot. Well, either creation is true or science is true. Well, why can't science and creation be true? Or either you're going to live by faith or you're going to live by science. Well, I think you should live by both. They try to mutually exclude one from the other and then divide it and say, well, either you're this or that. And what do you say when somebody does that? You're committing the either or fallacy. Let me demonstrate the either or fallacy for you. Either Mormonism is true or Catholicism is true. Mormonism is obviously not true, therefore Catholicism is true. Say, no, it's an either or fallacy because there's more than one option on the board. Now, either or fallacies are not a fallacy if there's only two choices. So when we talk about like God or not God, sometimes atheists say you're committing the either or fallacy. They've said that before. Not to me personally, but I've seen them say that before. When you refute atheism, they say, well, you haven't put any positive presentation forward to God. I have, actually. By refuting atheism, either God exists or he doesn't exist. That's either A or non-A. If I can refute non-A, I refute A. I substantiate A. By definition, that's not true when they say that. So an either or can be a fallacy, but it can also be true when there's only two options. But a lot of times there's not only two options. The no true Scotsman fallacy. Have you ever heard of that one? This is where you try to define a term to exclude everybody else. The no true Scotsman fallacy. It goes like this. No Scotsman puts sugar in his porridge. And the guy says, well, Angus is a Scotsman, and he puts sugar in his porridge. Say, well, no true Scotsman puts sugar in his porridge. See, so now they've tried to define the term. They do things like, well, no scientist believes in creation. So that's the no true Scotsman fallacy. What you mean is no scientist that disagrees with you is a true scientist. The scientists over at Answers in Genesis believe in a young earth. Why don't you? Oh, well, no true scientist believes in a young earth. Well, that's just prejudice. You say, well, you're just being prejudiced. As a matter of fact, I can name for you lots of people who are scientists, who got their PhDs not just from like a Christian college, but, got their PhDs from like Ohio State and things like that. They're scientists. The guy who invented the MRI machine, would you think he was a scientist? Yeah, well, he believes in a young earth. So that's a true Scotsman, no true Scotsman fallacy.
Gotcha.
Ad hominem arguments to the man. You got to be subtle about this. Ad hominem arguments is when somebody argues something about you and then makes that try to be relevant to your case. We can see it in examples like, well, we shouldn't listen to what's her name because she has blonde hair and blondes are dumb. Well, that's an ad hominem attack. You're not attacking her argument, you're attacking her. Okay. But sometimes they're not as quite as obvious as that. Some people might say, well, the only reason you're a Christian is because you were raised in Christianity. Somebody might say that. Well, yeah, but me being raised as a Christian doesn't have anything to do with whether or not my arguments for Christianity are correct or incorrect. Mm. You could just as easily say the only reason you believe in the times tables is you were taught it in school. If you weren't taught the times tables in school, you wouldn't believe it, right? No. See, it's an ad hominem argument. So sometimes these can be a little tricky. All right, we're getting on in time here, and I want to cover other things. So I want to cover some philosophical problems. So these are some logical problems in their argumentation. Now I want to cover some philosophical problems, which are also going to be logical problems as well.
Are they aware of these problems? The most aren't, are they?
Most are not, and most Christians don't. I've seen Christians argue this way. I argue this way. But a lot of times, I don't think I think the person on the street, the average atheist on the street who watches YouTube videos, I don't know, with the advent of YouTube, they might be, see more apologists, for Christianity. But that would be newer. As far as I'm concerned, like the most people that I run into, they have this idea in their head that what they believe is science and what you believe is faith. Mm-hmm. That's the average idea. And they say things like, well, the whole idea of God's still. So are we arguing evolution or are we arguing God? Because I want to go back to God if we're going to argue God. Anyway. All right, philosophical problems in evolution. The first philosophical problem I want to talk about is survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest. You ever heard of that? Okay. That was actually Darwin's contribution to science, by the way, was survival of the fittest. The idea of evolution predated Darwin. The idea that we all kind of had a common ancestor, although there were different takes on how that happened. But what Darwin did in his Origin of Species was he actually kind of put a scientific method to it. And the scientific method was that feces.
Finches.
Yeah. Finches in the Galapagos Island. He was looking at finches and the beaks, and some of them were longer. And so he said that species survive, and he tried to use that as an explanation for why some species survived and some died out. However, the philosophical problem with this is that survival of the fittest is actually a non-statement. It's just a reaffirmation of what you're already saying. So it'd be like saying that guy over there is an unmarried bachelor. Well, you're not saying anything new in the subject that you are in the predicate, okay? So, you're not saying anything new in the predicate than you are in the subject. That's begging the question.
Unmarried and bachelor.
Unmarried and bachelor are the same thing.
Because he's a guy.
He's unmarried. He's an unmarried.
So
That guy's an unmarried bachelor.
Right.
That unmarried guy there is a bachelor. Okay, so survival of the fittest. And this is a little bit of a longer loop, but it's basically, how do you know something is fittest for its environment? It survived. Who survives? Those who are fittest for their environment. There's really nothing new in the predicate that isn't already established in the subject. Survival of the fittest just means survivor of the survivors. Of course the fittest survive. That doesn't explain the arrival of the fittest. That doesn't explain the arrival of the fittest at all. That just says people survive. Yeah, they survive. Now, they tend to try to think that the reason why this thing survived, and what they'll do is they'll tell you a story that they can't observe. They tend to think that the reason why this thing survived was due to the fact that it was better suited for its environment because it was stronger or better in some way. And they'll tell you some story, like they'll say something like, let's say you have a genetic mutation in this cougar or this pack of animals. One of them gets stronger hindquarters, and then they're able to make it to the prey faster or to the water faster, and then therefore they're able to put their stronger genes into the next generation, and therefore that particular species survives. You've heard this before, I'm sure, right? Okay, the problem is that's a story, and it can be easily reversed. What would happen if the strongest antelope got to the water first and there's a crocodile there? And he eats the strong ones first, and all the strong ones die off first, and it's all the weaker ones that are left. See, so it's a story that they tell themselves about history that can't be verified and is easily reversed.
Or the wolf with the strong hindquarters, but it causes his heart to give out because
Right.
he's running faster.
Because he
But he
developed
Now he becomes a
stronger
sage.
hindquarters and didn't develop a stronger heart. Well, that's a problem. The other, so that's problem number one, is survival of the fittest. The other problem, the second problem, is transitional life forms. Now, when I talk about this with people, I'll be like, so tell me about transitional life forms. Can you tell me the benefit of having half of a feather? I mean, half of a feather would seem to be a hindrance rather than a help. So they have very good imaginations. They'll tell you, well, how they invented feathers or how they came about feathers was that they had a lizard, and this lizard was jumping to get the fly out of the air, and one was able to jump a little higher, and then eventually, he developed something that was long on his arm, and then he got to the food faster, and then he was able to, that scale that was longer on his arm became an advantage to him, or he was able to put that into the next generation. But it's, again, a story that's just as easily reversed. Say, well, I would think that would be not. What's the good of half of a feather? I mean, it might be a hindrance.
It's reversed by they were able to utilize what they were born with to what they're doing with it. You see what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
They had that at the very beginning. They just utilized it for that.
Right.
They were able to use it for it. Instead
Well,
of developing it.
think things are born the way they are.
They are, exactly.
One of the ways to see this the best, and this is a really good way to see this, is evolution is at conflict with itself, because it says the main driving force of evolution is to put your genes into the next generation. Okay. They also want to tell you on this world system that we went from amoebas that copulate asexually to copulating sexually. Which is better? If you're well, which is better? I guess that's.
Are we talking physically? Are we talking?
There's a lot of jokes in that one.
Which is more advantageous to put your genes into the next generation? Asexually. Why would we have ever gone to copulation if the goal is to put your genes into the next
Maximum amount of offspring.
Yeah, the maximum amount of offspring. Theoretically, we would have never made it past that if what's driving this is to put your genes into the next generation. And please tell me how we went from asexual reproduction to copulation, and please tell me how that happened gradually. How in the world did an organism go from?
I need
Did
this
it-
to do this.
Was there half a sexual organ developed, what's a half a sexual organ
It's useless.
is useless. Excuse me, doesn't do anything. Wouldn't if I mean something that can't produce into the next level. So see, it couldn't have happened. You can't go from asexual reproduction and go to sexual reproduction gradually, because
That's why
each one of those along those steps is useless. There's nothing. If you don't have a fully functioning uterus, for all adults, and a fully functioning male reproductive system, they don't produce offspring. Yes, what were you going to say?
That's why Stephen Gould
Right.
punctuated equilibrium. It happened fast. Because he understood that problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
He understood it. He understood the problems. That's why he said, well, it had to have been a burst of very quick change.
Yeah. Which is another story.
Right.
All right. Third one. We're gonna go a little over time there.
That's cool.
Okay. The third one is life arising from non-life. Okay. Philosophically, how does life arise from non-life? Complexity of structure does not create life. Okay. Complexity of structure does not create life.
It's like chaos does not produce.
Yeah,
peace.
well, doesn't, yeah, but I can take, you take somebody who just passed away, they have the whole complexity of structure there, but they're not alive. Okay, so complexity of structure does not create life. Neither does electricity, the Frankenstein thing. They did try that, by the way, in real life.
Yes, they did.
All they did was get fried people.
Crispy, yeah, very crispy.
They just got fried people. So how does life arise from non-life? It doesn't. It can't. Life cannot arise from non-life. All right. There are also scientific hoaxes that are easy to point out. We're not done. Scientific hoaxes. Caveman, Nebraska man, discovered in 1922, turned out to be the tooth of an extinct pig. Okay, so that's one I like to throw in their face. Now, I don't mind using scientific facts, remember, to embarrass them. Okay, so you're telling me evolution is true, then why are there so many scientific hoax? Lucy was discovered by Donald Johnson in the early 70s. The knee joint of Lucy was found over a mile away from the body and 200 feet deeper in the ground. A lot of people don't know that. So, how do you know that knee went with that?
Wasn't it a total of 18 bones?
I don't remember the
I think
exact
that's
total
what
of
it was.
bones.
Then they created this whole person in like 18 bones.
Yeah. Well, it's a chimp. The big deal about it is that it was said to walk more upright, which could have just been an extinct chimp. And it was thicker. It was a thicker had thicker bones to it than a normal chimp.
And they only found one?
No, they found pretty much the whole skeleton. They've got.
No, I mean like one.
Oh, one of those.
One body.
Yeah,
so to
one of
speak.
those bodies.
Okay, so maybe it was like a deformed birth.
Yeah, it could have been.
That's why it died.
That's true, right? It didn't look like it was too advantageous to its survival.
Exactly.
But part of the reason why they believe it walked upright was because of the knee joint. Because of the knee joints, they get into how things are. But again, the knee joint was found 200 or a mile away and 200 feet deeper.
By something totally different.
Yeah,
Maybe even a person.
Right. Geologic columns, a problem for them. It was invented by Charles Lyell. It's the only place the geological column is found is in the textbook. So you have to be aware of that. There's nowhere in the world where the geologic column's found. Now, pieces of the geologic column's found. They do find pieces of the geologic, but nowhere where you look at this, I think it's like 7 or 10 layers to it or something, you find it. There's nowhere in the world that they found that. That just exists in the textbook. They find pieces of it in different places, and sometimes they find a piece of it over another piece, and sometimes they find trees growing through all of them. Yeah.
So what you're telling me is that geologic column, they pieced it together for the book,
Yes.
but they don't exist in the same place at the same time.
No, pieces of it do though. Like you might find this certain layer, and then over here you find a certain layer.
But
And
the
you-
layers aren't on top of each
No.
other.
Sometimes.
They just measure
Yes.
from how deep it was found here to how deep it was found there, and then from that they reconstruct according to their model.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
The whole thing is not found anywhere. They find pieces of it, certain layers here, then another certain layers over somewhere else in China, and then these layers in Africa, but they pieced them together. Yeah.
That's what I mean.
Yes. So if that's what you mean, then yes, that's what I mean.
But they reconstruct it for their model.
Yeah. Yeah. There are all kinds of, I want to get to one, and then I'll leave you with this, and also with an assignment as well. Okay.
Column.
According to evolution, there was a big bang, and that there was this infinitesimal point of all energy and all matter was in one I'm trying to think of the word, infinite point that was no smaller than the period on a page. That's what they say, and that this began to spin, and then all the galaxies spun out of that. Okay, that's called the Big Bang Theory. That's everything exploded out of that. And then they do some measurement. They have like things that are shifting away from each other and stuff at a certain rate. But that's what they believe. There's this big spin and this big boom. Okay. The problem is there is what's called the conservation of angular momentum. Now, what the conservation of angular momentum says that when you have an object that's spinning, and you can do this on the playground or whatever, and things fly off of that object, they'll spin the same way that they flew off. They'll always spin the same way. You spin it and it'll spin the same way. Well, the sun is moving clockwise. The planets are moving counterclockwise. Venus and Uranus are rotating the opposite direction and on an opposite axis of all the other planets. 8 of the 91 moons that are orbiting in the solar system out there are rotating the opposite way that their planet's rotating. How is that even possible if what happened was it spun and everything flew out? It's not possible. You can't have a sun moving clockwise and the planets moving counterclockwise. And then all the planets moving this way and a couple of the planets moving this way around it. And the moons moving the opposite way of some of their planets. Those are scientific problems. The Psalms say the heavens declare the glory of God, the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night by night reveals its knowledge. Psalm 1, verses 1 through 4. Your assignment this week, because next week we're going to do role playing. Okay, I'm going to be Mr. Atheist, and you're going to talk to me about this. And I'm going to combine, kind of an atheistic evolutionary kind of thing. And it'll be voluntary. If you want to, you can do it. If you don't want to, that's fine. We'll probably only do about 15 minutes apiece or something like that. You need to memorize 3 facts, okay? Everybody can memorize 3 facts, and I want you to memorize them to as much detail as you as possibly can.
Doesn't matter what they are?
Nope. I want you to memorize 3 facts that you think will embarrass the evolutionists. Now, if you're very adventurous, you memorize 5.
Evolutionist or atheist?
Both. Either one. More than likely, it's like a scientific fact. So, for example, we were looking at a scientific fact the other day, or a few months back, about how they found living genetic material in dinosaur bones.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's pretty hard on old Earth. It's pretty difficult. Why would you find living genetic material in a dinosaur? They're not all fossilized. But I don't want you to just say that. Okay, I know where that dinosaur is. Know who discovered it. Okay, know as much about that situation as you can possibly know. 3 to 5. And that's all you need. Because when it comes to this stuff, you can dance somebody pillar to post by just 3 to 5 facts. You're talking to an evolutionist and they say, well, I believe the Big Bang Theory. And you say, well, do you know about the conservation of angular momentum? What's that? Well, it says that when things spin, or they might know. So, well, can you explain why the sun's moving clockwise and all the other planets are moving backwards? See, I'm using evidence to embarrass them. I'm using evidence to show that what they're saying about evolution couldn't possibly be true. An artifact that's found outside the geologic column, for instance, there's that footprint that's in Utah that's over a trilobite. Why is there a footprint over a trilobite? Now, a trilobite was something that supposedly went extinct millions and billions of years ago.
That's those little seashell.
But they found,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
there's all kinds of problems scientific problems in evolution. You need to memorize 3 to 5. If you're really adventurous, you really want to do it right, memorize 5. But 3 is generally all you need. But let me just say again that you don't need to memorize any facts in order to implement this. All you got to do is let them talk. If you let them talk and say, well, wait a minute, you're telling me that we went from asexual to sexual, that happened gradually, but you're also telling me that the reason why we're having evolution is to put our genes into the next. So you don't need any scientific, you're just reducing their argument to absurdity. Okay, but it's always fun to have 3 to 5 facts down. Okay.
Is it true about in the limestone in Texas, I believe it is, where they have human and dinosaur prints in the same limestone?
Yes, they do. Yeah, not Hugh Ross, Carl Baugh was the discoverer of that. And they had Nova there, and Nova was filming over his shoulder at the time, and they were pulling them out as they discovered them. I mean, if they were filming them, it's not like somebody could have come along and did it. They were digging it out while they were seeing those things. They were digging it up
And
as
the
it was happening.
response is?
Well, there's
Is it
always
the same-
saving devices. You got to remember that. There's always
same
saving
layer of
devices.
limestone,
It's
though.
the same layer of limestone. It is. So there are always saving devices. So there's different kinds of saving devices, but the saving device proves that they're grinding a presupposition. They're not looking at evidence. Their
Okay.
saving device sometimes is something like, well, it must have softened up and somebody ran across there later on or something like that.
Oh, I see.
You know, so-
And it's just-
Remember, dead men do bleed. Remember that. Okay, that's always the problem in bringing up the facts. Is sometimes they'll have some type of alternate explanation.
Right.
So I always bring up the hardest one. The one about genetic material still being alive in dinosaurs, pretty hard on an old Earth. That's a tough one to get around. All right.